And for those of you new to programming at Tikva, I would now like to introduce you to Eric Gertner. Eric is a retired lawyer who was the director of research at the firm McCarthy Tetro for almost 30 years. He is also co-founder of the Supreme Court Law Review and has taught at Osgoode Hall Law School. Eric also has an interest and teaches many courses on the law and the Holocaust. Our first two sessions with Eric will deal with the Nuremberg trials, and then we'll move on to discussions around the COVID-19 pandemic, comparisons being made to the Holocaust, Jews, and vaccines. And now I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thank you, Gail. As always, I'm honored to be invited to speak to your members and the non-members who call in or dial in. So I'm going to start with the question of why talk about the Nuremberg trials today. Well, there are a number of obvious reasons. The first one is this year, and in fact, this month, is the 75th anniversary of the first indictment issued in respect of the Nuremberg trials. And the first trial, the International Military Tribunal, which I'm going to be talking about today, started in November. So it's obviously a very propitious time to be talking about the Nuremberg trials. But people might say, well, that's all old news. Why are we talking about the Nuremberg trials? It's history. Well, of course, you might want to learn a little bit about history, but it's also important to talk about the Nuremberg trials and what they did and how they did it in light of the fact that the Nuremberg trials are the precursor to the International Criminal Court, which now exists as a matter of international law. And it's also important to talk about the Nuremberg trials and what was established at the Nuremberg trials with respect to the actions of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust at a time when there is still obviously lots of Holocaust denial. And today in particular, we see a lot of trivialization of the Holocaust, and that will become apparent when we talk about Holocaust comparisons in the third week. I thought before I get into the substance of the trial itself, I thought I might just provide you with a little backdrop to how or why we're talking about this and what's important about the backdrop to the trial. So there are lots of things that many of you will know. There are many things that many of you will know. But I think it's important to sort of give you an idea of what led up to the beginning of the war in September of 1939. It's important to understand what the Nazis were doing, and it'll be obviously very important when we come to talk about Holocaust comparisons in the third week. But I thought I'd just mention a lot of these steps that the Nazis took from 1933 to 1939. So in 1933, Hitler became the chancellor. He was elected by about 33% of the population. And one of the first acts that he undertook.
Oops. Sorry, Eric, we can't hear you. You're on mute by accident.
That's insane.
I'm not even doing anything. It's just muting itself. Anyway, so the Weimar Constitution was very similar to modern democratic constitutions that we know today. It protected all kinds of civil liberties, freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. But it had one fatal flaw. It had a provision that allowed the chancellor to suspend the Constitution. And of course, that's the first legal act that Hitler undertook. He suspended the Constitution, which allowed him to do all of these things that I'm just going to mention, which were all done according to law in Germany, therefore, at the time. And again, many of you will know most of these things. So early on, Jews were stripped of their citizenship. And even though they had been, or their families had been in Germany for hundreds of years, Jews at the time lost their citizenship. Jews were excluded from a variety of professions, the most important professions: medicine, law, accounting, engineering, and education. All Jewish Professors at universities, all Jewish teachers in the public schools were dismissed from their jobs unceremoniously. So there were those steps. Eventually, Jews were required to register, and then they were required to register their property. And they were required to pay if certain vandalism occurred, even though it might have been instigated by the Nazis themselves. Eventually, they were stripped of virtually all civil rights. Obviously, I've talked about the most important, but it went from the most important to the most trivial. So, for example, Jews were not allowed in public parks. Jews were not allowed to own dogs. And you can just imagine what else was prohibited to Jews at the time. When Jews were able to leave, basically they could not leave with their property. When Jews were ultimately transported to the camps after the war started, or even before the war started in some cases, their property was basically expropriated. So Jews lost a lot of their property, or most of their property. Their businesses, in many cases, had to be sold at reduced prices. We know that property like art and valuable books and other things were taken by the Nazis. It's estimated that 1/3 of the cost of the German war effort was paid for by Jews by losing their property or having to pay fines to the German government. 1/3. That is a huge number. It's estimated that number is about $127 billion in today's dollars. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. Jews who were transported to the camps, either from Germany or from the occupied countries, were forced to pay the cost of their transportation to the camps. Just think about that, including children. Children had to pay for their transport. Wasn't a lot, but the amounts that were collected went to the German state railway authority, by which they raised $600 million. So that's a pretty significant number in itself. And we know, of course, that ultimately the war resulted in 11 million people being killed. 6 million, it's estimated, of them were Jews. Some were murdered in the Holocaust by bullets on the Eastern Front, and others were obviously killed in the camps, and others were sold into slavery. And again, the companies that received slave laborers paid the government for those slaves. So we can talk about what happened in the US South. This is really no different than that. So that's the backdrop to before the war even starts, and obviously some things that happen afterwards. So it's important when we start to talk about the trial, it's important to understand a few preliminary facts. Obviously, this was the first trial of this kind in certainly modern history and probably in all of history. The trial didn't just happen all of a sudden after the Allies had won the war. The Allies had already begun planning for these trials starting in 1943. The three major allies, the US, the UK, and Soviet Union, had entered into an agreement to conduct and carry out these trials without specifying the nature of the trials that would be conducted. That ultimately led, of course, when the war was won, to decide whether to proceed with their agreement. There were obviously some differences about how to proceed. The Soviets wanted to have, not surprisingly, show trials, which they were very good at by this point in time, which would result in the trial and execution of 50 to 100,000 Nazis. Churchill was not surprisingly in favor of a full trial like the one that occurred. He was more in favor of summary trials, which would focus on about 50,000 of the major criminals. But the Americans insisted on proceeding with a proper trial with protections for the defendants and due process as well. The idea for the trial was obviously being discussed throughout the years between 43 and 45. It was agreed to by Roosevelt before he passed away, and ultimately implemented by Truman when he became the president. Now, it's, what they didn't want and what they didn't do is focus on the Holocaust. The first international military tribunal focused on the war of aggression conducted by the Germans, war crimes that they committed, and other things, but without a focus specifically on the number of Jews were murdered and how they were murdered. And obviously that evidence did come out, but it wasn't the focus. And in fact, there was concern in some corners about making the murder of the Jews the central issue in any of these trials. One of the prosecutors at Nuremberg was a fellow by the name of Thomas Dodd. His son, Christopher Dodd, eventually became a senator from the state of Connecticut. And he wrote a series of letters back to his wife in Connecticut, which Christopher Dodd ultimately put together in a book. And one of those letters contains the following passage, which I'm going to read to you. It says, I have despised anti-Semitism. You know how strongly I feel toward those who preach intolerance of any kind with that knowledge. You will understand when I tell you that this staff is about 25% Jewish. Now, my point is that the Jews should stay away from this trial for their own sake. Mark this well, the charge of a war for the Jews is still being made in the post-war years. It will be made again and again. The too large percentage of Jewish men and women will be cited in proof of this. Sometimes it seems that the Jews will never learn about these things. They seem intent on bringing new difficulties down on their own necks. I do not like to write about this matter. It is distasteful to me, but I am disturbed about it. They are they are pushing and crowding out the competing with each other and everyone else. So, if you read the first part of the statement, he says he hates anti-Semitism, but the statements he makes right at the end of the paragraph I just quoted are clearly the kinds of things that you would often hear about Jews in America and in other places. So Jews were not the central focus of the International Military Tribunal. There was obviously evidence of what happened to the Jews, but it wasn't a trial about genocide. And in fact, the concept of genocide in 1945 was not even recognized in international law. That happened sometime soon after the Nuremberg trials, but it wasn't accepted in international at the time. Organizing a trial, remember the war ends in May of 1945, and the trial begins in November of that same year. So it's 6 months. Can you imagine the amount of work that had to be done to organize this particular trial? First of all, they had to find a location. And ultimately they settled on Nuremberg, even though a large part of the city was destroyed by Allied bombing. It was also, of course, the center of a lot of Nazi rallies, and a lot of the laws that I mentioned earlier, discriminating against Jews, were first announced at Nuremberg rallies. So I think there was some symbolic nature to the choice of Nuremberg, but it did have a huge palace of justice, which had not been destroyed, and that was the site of this trial and many of the other trials at Nuremberg. But you had to find the prosecutors. You had to find the judges for this trial. And remember, this trial is different than the next 12 trials, 2 of which I'm going to talk about next week. This was a trial that was conducted by a judge from each of the major Allied countries. So that's the United States, the UK, the Soviet Union, and France. So they had to find 4 judges, and they were all already judges in their own countries. They had to find 4 alternate judges as well, in case something happened to the main judge. They had to find prosecutors. They had to find staff. They had to find facilities for all the people. They had to find the evidence that would support the charges that they were going to lay. And that obviously took a lot of time and a lot of work. And ultimately that was accomplished. I'm going to talk about some of the prosecutors involved in this trial and some of the other trials as they relate to this trial. I'm going to talk about some of the other individuals involved in the trial. There were obviously interrogators and translators and reporters, all of whom participated in one way or another in this trial. The first trial resulted in the charges against 24 leaders of the Nazi regime. And I'm going to mention a bunch of names. Many of them will be familiar to you, some may not be. And a number of the individuals who were charged were convicted and executed. Others received prison sentences. There were a few who were acquitted, and there were a few who were convicted, but avoided the ultimate penalty because they committed suicide before execution could be carried out. So the first group I'm going to mention are sort of leaders of the Nazi regime, I would say. They are Martin Bormann, who was tried in absentia because he was not in the hands of the Allies. Hans Frank, who was the so-called Governor General of occupied Poland by the Germans. Hermann Göring, who was the head of the Nazi Party in a traditional sense, and he was also the head of the Luftwaffe, who obviously played a major role in the bombing of Britain and all the European countries that ultimately were occupied by the Germans. Rudolf Hess, who was the deputy Führer until he went off and flew off to Scotland to try to make a deal with the British to end the war. Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and who was the individual involved in negotiating the agreement with the Soviet Union called the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Agreement, which basically divided Poland just before the war starts, and which obviously gave the Germans a free hand to invade Poland up to the demarcation line with the Russians. But obviously later the Germans ignored that, and in 1941, in the summer, they crossed the line and invade occupied Poland by the Soviets and march into the Soviet Union proper. Alfred Rosenberg, who was sort of the philosophical head of the Nazi regime, and he became important for the looting program conducted by the Nazi regime throughout the war. His organization were responsible for the looting of the major pieces of art that you've heard about, the plunder of books, Jewish and non-Jewish, of value, et cetera, et cetera. Albert Speer, who was Hitler's favorite architect and became the head of the Ministry for Armaments, so the creation of the war machine. And the last person in this major group is Julius Streicher, who is the main propagandist for the Nazi Party and the Nazi regime. And all of those people were convicted and executed, except for Speer, who spent many years in prison, and Rudolf Hess, who basically died in prison, in the Spandau prison in Germany, and Hermann Göring because he committed suicide. So that's the main group. The next group I want to talk about is the military group, and there's a number of heads of the German military: Karl Donitz, Alfred Jodl, Ernest Kaltenbrunner, William Keitel, and Erich Reuter. They were also defendants in this first international military tribunal. And Jodl, Kaltenbrunner, and Keitel were convicted and executed. The other two, one received 10 years and served most of that, but was then released. And the last one, Reuter, was sentenced to life, but basically served about 8 or 9 years, was released, and died 5 years later. Then we have another group who basically ran the Nazi government. So we have Wilhelm Frick, who is the Minister of Justice, Walter Funk, who was the Minister of Economics, Baron Konstantin von Neurath, who was another minister of foreign affairs, and Franz von Papen, who was the chancellor and ultimately became an ambassador to Turkey and Austria. And they were, William Frick, who was the Minister of Justice, was convicted and executed, but the rest received prison sentences. And again, most of them didn't serve their full term. There were a few sort of glitches in the trial. One of the individuals who was charged was a Krupp, one of the members of the Krupp family. And of course, you probably know that Krupp was very much involved in the armament business, arming the German war machine. Unfortunately, they charged the wrong Krupp, and he was eventually acquitted. But later on, the right Krupp was convicted in the trial involving the Krupp organization itself. As I said, Bormann was tried in absentia. There were obviously other major criminals who were not in the hands of the Allies, like Mengele, who was never caught and therefore never tried. There were others who evaded sentencing or trial and sentencing, like Himmler, who committed suicide, and Goebbels, who also committed suicide with his wife. But before he did that, he killed his 4 children. And that all took place in the Hitler bunker the day after Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide at the end of April. And of course, another of the major Nazi war criminals who didn't take part in the International Military Tribunal proceedings was Adolf Eichmann, who was not yet captured, but eventually, about 15 years later, he is captured in Argentina and he's brought to Israel to be tried, and he's ultimately tried and convicted for his role in the final solution. Okay, of course, there were many people who could have been tried, and people have debated how many people should have been tried. I just want to mention that while I'm just focusing today on the International Military Tribunal, and next week I'll talk about 2 other trials that took place in Nuremberg of the other 12 trials, you have to understand there were many trials that took place throughout Europe, either before 1945, and I'll mention that in a minute, and certainly after 1945. There were Auschwitz trials in Germany, there were Auschwitz trials in Poland, there were virtually war criminal trials throughout Europe, not only trials of war criminals, but also thousands of collaborators were tried in a variety of countries, especially in Western Europe. The IMT was not the first war crimes trial. There were 2 trials conducted by the Russians, one in 1943 and one in 1944, as they were marching west and pushing the Germans back. They were more or less, I would say, summary trials. The first one took a day and the next one took a couple of days, but they did occur. And I don't think they set a precedent for what was to happen at Nuremberg, but just it's important to understand that this was already taking place. And certainly the Soviets could justify these trials because of the agreement that had already been made in 1943 with the Allies. Okay. So the trial, as I said, it begins in 1945. I've already mentioned that they had to line up prosecutors, they had to line up the judges, they had to line up defense counsel for each of the accused. They could appoint defense counsel, or the accused could choose his own defense counsel, and defense counsel's fees were paid for by the Allies in order to ensure that there was a proper protection of the rights of the individuals on trial. And all of that was accomplished, and the rules for the trial set out in an agreement between the 3 allies, where again they set out not only the charges that would be laid, but also set out the procedural protections that would be afforded to the criminals, and also provisions that excluded certain defenses. So the crimes which they were ultimately charged with were crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This agreement that I'm talking about sets out the details of these charges, but I want to focus on a couple of articles which deal with the defenses that would not be available to the accused. Article 6 of the agreement says the tribunal established by the agreement, referred to in Article 1 hereof, for the trial and punishment of the major war criminals of the European Access countries, shall have the power to try and punish persons who, acting in the interests of European Access countries, whether individuals or as members of organizations, committed any of the following crimes, which are the crimes I mentioned. The next Article 7 says the official position of the defendants, whether heads of state, responsible officials in government departments, shall not be considered as freeing them from responsibility or mitigating punishment. That provision is to deal with this concept of what's known as sovereign immunity in international law. And Article 8 says the fact that the defendants acted pursuant to an order of the government or of a superior shall not free him from personal liability, but may be considered in mitigation of punishment if the tribunal determines that justice so requires. So that provision took care of the argument which all of the defendants made, which is I was just following orders. And basically Article 8 said, sorry, that's not a defense, but we could take it into account in dealing with punishment. Article 16 sets out the sort of due process rights of the accused, and specifically significant here is the agreement provides that all documents are to be translated into the 4 official languages of the proceedings: French, German, English, and Russian. French, German, English, and Russian, that's 4. And also provides that translators will be provided to all the accused, and all of the proceedings ultimately are conducted with translators or interpreters present to translate in each one of these four languages. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later. So how were they able to conduct these trials in basically a year, or a little less than a year, with everything having to be translated into these languages, especially into the languages that would allow the prosecution team to understand the German documents, because they were all in German? And how would they be able to conduct the trial with the interpreters? Up to this point in time, trials were basically conducted with translators or interpreters by having the witness testify, and then the translator or interpreter interpreting what they had said. So things were done consecutively. The Allies realized that if they adopted this process, the trial would go on forever, because obviously allowing the witness to testify and then having it translated just doubles the time that everything would take. So instead of it taking 11 months, it would have taken perhaps 22 months or even longer. They ultimately came up with a solution. About 20 years before the trial, there had been some developments spearheaded by somebody known as Edward Filene, who had, with a partner, devised a way of providing simultaneous translation. That is, as the witness was testifying, it was already being translated by the translator or interpreter. And this was the process that they eventually adopted. It's now obviously used widely in all kinds of international conferences. Every time we watch our news, when we hear Prime Minister Trudeau speak in French and we get a translation in English, that's simultaneous translation. Obviously, you have to have people who are very gifted in this ability, but eventually they did find people who could do this. The Allies eventually enter into an agreement with IBM to provide them with all of the electronic material to enable this to happen, which was obviously a very interesting choice, because IBM, before the war and during the war, had been providing certain kinds of assistance to the Nazis especially in respect of keeping records of all of the prisoners and concentration camp inmates so that the Germans could keep records of all these people. Ultimately, IBM is sued much later on. The case is eventually settled and they pay $3 million. So IBM is sort of playing both sides of the fence. Their subsidiary in Germany is providing assistance to the Nazis, and after the war, they're providing assistance to the Allies with this simultaneous translation procedure. All right. And if you want to read about IBM's role in the Holocaust, there's a book by a fellow by the name of Edwin Black called IBM and the Holocaust, which has been published and republished many, many times. Okay, so let's talk about some of the personalities at this trial. So the chief counsel for the US was Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson was actually, before he accepted this role, was a member of the United States Supreme Court. So he had a leave of absence to be the chief prosecutor or chief counsel at the Nuremberg trial, especially this first trial. He was assisted by a fellow by the name of Telford Taylor, who wrote one of the great books about the Nuremberg trials called The Anatomy of the Nuremberg Trials. And has written many other books as well. And obviously they had to have many other prosecutors for this trial and for the subsequent trials as well. And of the judges, there were many well-respected judges from each of the countries. One of the main judge from the UK was the president of the court. There was obviously a judge from the Soviet Union by the name of Rudenko. His legal abilities were sometimes questioned by the Soviets themselves, but nevertheless, they did have 4 judges, and that's how they proceeded. Coming back to this issue of simultaneous translation, where were they going to find the people to carry out the simultaneous translation? So first, let me talk about how they did this. First of all, they worked in teams of 4, obviously one for each of the languages that was relevant to the proceedings. So if a witness testified in German, it would have to be translated into the other 3 languages. The accused obviously would understand because they spoke German. If you had a witness who was Russian, it would have to be translated as well into all the languages for all of the people there. So there were 3 main teams, 2 alternate teams, and a sort of a backup team, and they operated in teams of 4. And so they would operate for a couple of hours, they would have to get a break, another team would come in, and this would go on for obviously months. Some of the individuals involved in the simultaneous translation system are interesting individuals in and of themselves. There are a number of young Jews, German Jews, who ultimately become translators at Nuremberg. They are individuals who obviously were able to leave Germany. Many of them left and were able to get to the United States, signed up with the American Army and made it back to Europe in that capacity. And ultimately, some of them were actually asked to participate in the translation, others offered their services. So I'm just going to mention a few because they're interesting individuals. One of the translators was a man by the name of Siegfried Ramler, who is a German, and he was able to escape and became a translator at the Nuremberg trials at the age of 22. Awesome responsibility for a 22-year-old. Another one was a fellow by the name of Armin Jakubowicz. He became a Nuremberg translator at the age of 30 after years as a Jewish refugee, also having spent time in prison camps as probably a foreign alien. His parents died in the final solution, but he, as I said, became a translator, and his granddaughter ultimately wrote a book about his experience called 50 Years 50 Years of Silence, which describes his role as a translator at Nuremberg. Another individual is Peter Less. Again, similar story. He is very young. He's about 25 at the time he becomes a translator. His parents, his sister, and his grandmother all died in the Holocaust, but he became a translator in Nuremberg. And one other individual I'll mention is a more colorful individual, is a fellow by the name of Wolf Frank. I could not find anything about his age, but he is described as he's given the nickname of the Voice of Doom. He was of Jewish descent. I think one of his parents was not Jewish. He was described as a playboy, an engineer, a resistance fighter, and somebody who had helped to smuggle out money and Jews from Europe. He was able to get to Great Britain. He was interned as an enemy alien for a period of time. He eventually enlisted in the British Army and achieved the rank of captain. At the time he left for England, he did not speak a word of English, but he was recognized eventually as the best of the translators at Nuremberg. And of course, he also wrote a book about his experience called The Voice of Doom. I've already described how they operated, so I don't have to do that again. So let me talk, and I've talked about some of the people involved in the prosecution team. One individual I want to talk about who actually wasn't involved in the prosecution team itself, like at the hearing, is a name that might be familiar to some of you. His name is Benjamin Ferencz, who is now, I think, 101 years old, or 102 maybe. At the time that he started work at Nuremberg, he was 25 years old. His parents had left Russia after the pogroms. He graduated from Harvard Law School and then enlisted in the American Army. And he eventually, at the age of 27, is the chief prosecutor of one of the Nuremberg trials involving the Einsatzgruppen. And that's the groups that were responsible for the Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe. His role for the first trial was basically to gather the evidence necessary to prosecute the individuals on trial at the MIT. He describes his role, or Wikipedia describes his role as follows. He was assigned to a team tasked with setting up a war crimes branch and collecting evidence for such trials. In that role, he was sent to the concentration camps that had been liberated by the US Army. And he obviously plays a very important role in, as I said, in a subsequent trial, but he also has a role even after the trials end. He is involved in negotiating the first agreement for compensation between Germany and Israel, which is negotiated in 1951, which becomes the subject of a great deal of opposition both in Israel and Germany, and that's a whole different story. He also is involved in other respects. He is a person who strongly believes in international law, but he also played a role in obtaining compensation for a group of mainly Polish women who became known as the Rabbits of Ravensbrück, and is the subject matter of a book called The Lilac Girls, which I highly recommend that you read. It's a fascinating story, which doesn't really go into the Benjamin Ferencz's role, but it's an interesting story that you should read in any event. Okay. So Benjamin Ferencz obviously is Jewish. Many of the prosecutors at the various trials were Jewish, and I'm just going to mention some of them. And I'm going to mention some that stand out in particular. So I've mentioned Ferencz. This story is an amazing story because he's so young and given so much responsibility, and he's still at this game of trying to deal with war crimes. Another of the lawyers involved in Nuremberg, not in the IMT trial, was a woman by the name of Cecilia Gotz. And again, it's an interesting story. And I'm going to read again from a description of her in Wikipedia. She is somebody who goes to law school. She's at the New York University Law School. She is the first female to be the head of a law review at the New York University Law School. She stands first in her class, but not surprisingly, given the time, she has difficulty finding a job. She hears about the activities in Nuremberg, and she eventually applies for a position there. And here's what Wikipedia says. After initially being rebuffed, Goods took a job at the Department of Justice in the equivalent of today's civil division. She applied to serve as a Nuremberg prosecutor, was rebuffed again at the instance of the Department of War, but was eventually given a waiver of disability by Telford Taylor so she could serve. The disability was her gender. She had been offered a supervisor's role at Justice, the first woman to be given such an opportunity, but declined in favor of the work at Nuremberg. She later becomes a judge and serves on the bench for many, many years. But again, this is just an interesting story that takes place in the context of this landmark trial. And it's important for me to point out that there were actually a number of women lawyers who took part in the prosecution at Nuremberg. I haven't got time to talk about all of them, but in the links that you'll be provided with, you will find a number of links to a list of some of these women and a speech delivered by Diane Marie Amen, who has written extensively about these women at Nuremberg. And in fact, she writes not just about the women lawyers, she writes about all the women at Nuremberg. And I'm going to talk about some of those other women a little bit later. Okay. Well, I'm not going to get very far. There's only 5 minutes left. So I'm happy to continue, but what I actually think I'll do is I'll give you sort of half the story and probably be able to finish next week and still do the other two trials that I want to talk about, the doctor's trials and the judge's trial. But let me just talk a little bit here. In addition to the translators, there were also other translators not involved in the court proceedings, but people who had to translate their millions of documents that the Allies were able to get their hands on after they defeated the Nazi regime. And also they had to be people who could interrogate the accused in their own language and obviously explain that to the English American prosecution team. So one of these was a fellow by the name of Howard Trieste. He left Germany for Luxembourg in 1939, eventually moved on to the US, where he was able to join his sister. His parents were sent from France into Auschwitz and both died, but he eventually becomes a translator and interrogates a number of the leading criminals on trial at the IMT. He interviews Hermann Göring, again, with in this case, with a psychiatrist who was sent in to determine whether they were fit to be tried. As I said, he interviews Hermann Göring, who he describes as pompous. He interviews Rudolf Hess, who describes him to be like a zombie. He also interrogates Rudolf Höss, who was the head of the Auschwitz concentration camp, who he describes as cold-blooded, and he also interviewed Julius Streicher, who he describes as the biggest anti-Semite of all. He is eventually asked to meet with Streicher. Streicher has some documents which he is asked to hand over to the prosecution, and specifically the psychiatrist who's examining him, and he refused to do so. And instead, he wants to speak to somebody who obviously is not Jewish, and Trieste walks in. Trieste is blonde and blue-eyed, and Streicher is very happy to hand over the documents to Trieste without recognizing or realizing that he's a Jew. There are others involved in this interrogation business as well. One of the individuals, and maybe I'll just stop there and take questions, is a gentleman by the name of Richard Sonnenfeld. Richard Sonnenfeld is another individual who is able to, at a young age, leave Germany. He ultimately joins up with the American Army, and he has a role to play at the trials as well. I'm trying to find the passage. Anyway, let me take the questions. I'll get the passage before we finish, because he's a fascinating, well, I don't need to read the passage. He's a fascinating individual. He's obviously incredibly bright. After his tour in Nuremberg at the trial, he returns to the US. He goes to college, university. He receives an engineering degree. He becomes a big macher in corporate America. He's involved in the RCA movement from black and white TVs to color TV. He works for NASA. He's an amazing individual, given the fact that he had to leave his home country at a young age, thrown into the war and these roles, but able to do so much after he finished his role at Nuremberg. So, questions?
Thank you, Eric. We do have one question that one of our someone put in the chat and directed to everyone. Was the defendant Alfred Rosenberg Jewish, or did he just have Jewish ancestry?
No, there are lots of Germans with the name Rosenberg. Lots of Germans with the name, the end of their name is Berg. No, he was not Jewish.
And a question that I have, where was Canada? Why was Canada not involved in any way? They were an ally.
They were an ally. They weren't involved in any of these trials. They weren't an occupier of Europe after the war. That's one thing. They were obviously a significant player in the war effort, but they weren't a major country, a major ally of the kind that I've described, France and England. And France and England obviously were important because they were attacked, the US because they were the savior, and the Soviet Union because they did the other part of saving. You know, they lost 20 million men in the war. So they obviously had an important role. One of the interesting things about this trial is if you look at those 4 countries, 2 of them are common law countries, the US and the UK, where the system is you're presumed to be innocent and the onus is on the state to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. France and the Soviet Union are civil law jurisdictions where, you know, there's no presumption of innocence, and the process for trying people doesn't have the same kinds of protections generally as you'd have in the common law system. So how did they meld these 4 systems, or these 2 systems together to get a trial? Well, the Russians obviously wanted to have the trials as summary as possible. The Americans disagreed. The Americans ultimately got the say on how the trials were to be conducted with all the protections, because they realized that without that, the legitimacy of the trial, which already had challengers, would be even more in question. So all of those protections are included in the ultimate agreement for the conduct of this trial.
Just a reminder, if people have questions, they can put them in the chat to your right. Another question is, what about the war in the Pacific? Was there any trials related to what happened in Japan or with the US and Japan?
Well, there were trials in Tokyo after the war. There were war crime trials of the Japanese. And there were actually some Canadian war crimes or Canadian conducted war crime trials in the Pacific theater as well, and mainly because of the treatment of Canadian POWs by the Japanese. So they did have a role to play there. And those trials did not take as long as obviously the trials at Nuremberg. They were sort of perfunctory. And eventually, while all these trials take place in Nuremberg over a 3 or 4 year period, there are 13 trials, as I said. that's everybody starts to walk away, because basically what happens is the Cold War intervenes. And we see that already in some of the disagreements between the Soviets and the Americans at Nuremberg, and this trial in particular. There's a very interesting article that's just come out in the New York Review of Books, because there's a new book on the role of the Soviets at the Nuremberg trials by an author by the name of Francine Hirsch. And the article in the New York Review of Books, which I'll try to load up for you because I'm not sure it'll be accessible, is really fascinating, because it talks about all the disagreements, in some cases, the lack of professionalism of the Soviets, which is not surprising because they didn't really do trials. Their trials were, you're already guilty, show up in court, sign your confession, we're off to the races. So this was a whole new experience for them, and they weren't necessarily prepared for what was going to happen at Nuremberg itself.
Yeah, that was interesting to read how the Soviets were working with the Americans to prosecute the Germans. So thanks for that interjection. Now, has there been, I guess, following Nuremberg, we have the international courts set up. Have they tried any other cases since Nuremberg?
Right. So the International Criminal Court is set up in, I think, the late 1990s or early 2000s. Before that, the Nuremberg trials are a precedent for the criminal trials that take place because of the genocide in Rwanda, and for the genocide trials that take place after the war between Bosnia and Serbia and Herzegovina and all that, when the Yugoslavian state fell apart. So they set the precedent for that. The International Criminal Court is set up after those trials take place. The International Criminal Court has done some cases involving Yugoslavian war criminals, but most of their trials have involved African dictators who have been engaged in genocide of one group or another in their own country. And the African countries are getting a little upset because the only people who get tried by the International Criminal Court seem to be Africans.
And what's the US involvement in that?
The US has no involvement because they don't recognize the International Criminal Court. They're not parties to the international agreement to establish the criminal court, and nor is Israel, because Israel is obviously concerned that they will be blamed for things that they've done in Gaza or Syria or wherever. The Americans never want to have their people subject to the laws of some other jurisdiction. And so they've never agreed to be bound by the International Criminal Court.
We have a question here in the chat. Is there any accuracy to judgment at Nuremberg?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I was going to actually end today's talk by talking about the movie. The movie is Judgment at Nuremberg. And if you recall the movie, it's a trial that takes place with 4 judges from 4 different countries. And the people who are accused at that trial are not the people I've mentioned. They are either German prosecutors, lawyers, or judges. And they're tried for their bending the rule of law. I'll leave it at that. So obviously, some of that is depicted is accurate in the sense that it took place in Nuremberg. There's this court, but that trial, as you'll learn next week, is not conducted by 4 judges. It's conducted by 3 American judges. And the defendants, as I said, are not these leading Nazi criminals. They're judges who perverted the law in Germany after Hitler comes to power, and prosecutors who also played a part in that. Nevertheless, the movie is fantastic. It received 10 Academy Awards. The cast is incredible. While it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, it received 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Actor. There were 2 Best Actor nominations that the movie received. One is Spencer Tracy, who's the American judge. The other is Maximilian Schell, who was one of the German lawyers defending his client. Maximilian Schell's family was a family from, I can't remember, either Germany or Austria. They flee to Switzerland because they don't like what's happening. So Maximilian Schell is actually like a refugee, like a lot of other people during that period of time. And the other Academy Award they win is for the screenplay, which is written by Abby Mann. One footnote, this is a person who didn't receive an Academy Award nomination, is the person who wrote the music for the movie. And in my opinion, music in movies is really important because it sets the mood. And the person who composed that music was a fellow by the name of Ernst Gold, who was the composer of the music for Exodus, and himself a refugee from Nazi Germany. He was able to leave, obviously, before the war started, made a career in Hollywood, wrote the music for about 100 different movies. But the only Academy Award I think he won was the one for Exodus. And he was married to Marnie
Nixon.
The person who did the voiceover for Judy Garland, the singing of Judy Garland, I believe. So that's sort of a footnote. But it's a great movie. It obviously raises all kinds of issues that are relevant to these kinds of proceedings. But it's not a depiction of that first trial.
Oh, someone put Marnie Nixon. Yes. Thank you, Rini. Okay, before we're going to wrap up, it's 2 o'clock. Just give us a preview of next week.
Okay, so next week, as I've said, there were actually 13 trials at Nuremberg. The first one is this big one, the International Military Tribunal. The second one is the doctors' trial, which involved the doctors who were involved in the euthanasia programs, the medical experiment programs in the various camps, etc. And it's the first trial in which a woman is an accused. One of the doctors from Ravensbrück is on trial there. And the other trial I'm going to talk about is the judge's trial, which we've just been talking about. Those to me are the reason why those 3 trials are the first 3 trials. Obviously, the first one is because they got the big wigs. The doctor's trial and the judge's trial is important because these are, in most places, are the most trusted professionals. Doctors are obviously looked to for all kinds of reasons. Lawyers, while they are obviously many times made fun of, but without the lawyers, both the prosecution and the defense and the civil lawyers, we couldn't have a rule of law that would operate. So I think they picked those trials at the beginning because they wanted to set the precedent of how people in these major professions should be behaving. What's interesting about those 2 professions is a large proportion of those 2 professions became members of the Nazi Party. For doctors, it's about 50% of all doctors became members of the Nazi Party. For lawyers, it's also high. There may be different reasons for why they did what they did, but it's actually astonishing that you had those numbers. Obviously, Jews had been members of both of those professions for a long time, but really, they'd only really come into their own in Germany, probably in the last 50 or 100 years. And so this was about the first time that Jews made up a significant proportion of lawyers in Germany, especially in the major urban centers, and doctors. And obviously, very early on in the Nazi regime, they lose their jobs, they lose their positions. All the Jewish judges, of which there were still growing numbers, all lose their jobs. So it's important that you focus on these 2 groups who are generally highly respected members of this community and society.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay.
And we look forward to seeing everyone back again next Thursday at 1 o'clock. So
Okay.
thanks, everyone.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.